All right, welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, Episode 2, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder and deliver some thoughts on games to you as I walk home from the train. I'm Brendan Riley. This podcast comes to you from Rattlebox Games. Today is January 24th. It's just after 3 o'clock in suburban Chicago. The weather is 28 degrees. It's a nice day today for walking home, although the sky is, as William Gibson would say, the color of a TV tuned to a dead channel. I love that line. So today, I thought I would talk about what really gets me about the games that I really like. If you go to my Board Game Geek page, my username is Wombat929, you will find that I have put as some of my favorite games a number of games by people like Martin Wallace. I have several Martin Wallace games in my top 50. I have the games from Mind Clash. I have Anachrony and Trickerion. And I have a number of other games. And I was thinking about what is it about these games in particular that gets me excited, why is it that these games are my favorite? You know, other games will be my favorite for other reasons. A Touch of Evil is one of my favorite games. That game is, it's about theme. I love it for its theme. But there's not a whole lot to it in terms of gamerly qualities. But I was thinking about what is the one thing that a game can do that will make me want to come back to it time and time again? And I don't have a word for it, but I do have a description of the feeling. And I guess the phrase I would use is just not quite enough. What I mean by that is my favorite moments in gaming are moments where I'm trying to figure out how to do what I want to do, and it feels like I have just not quite enough resources to do it. So let me give you an example because that feels pretty vague. One game that I really like is a game called Anachrony. Anachrony is a it's a Euro worker placement game with a lovely theme of time travel. You represent a faction. Oh, hold on, a school bus is going by. This would be a bunch of middle schoolers going home. Afternoon, kiddos. Okay, so Anachrony is a time travel themed worker placement game. In Anachrony, you play the leader of a group of survivors in a sort of post-apocalyptic wasteland, or in the far future of the Earth, and you're trying to survive. You receive a message from the future saying that a huge meteor is coming and it's going to hit the Earth and cause all kinds of devastation, and you have just a little bit of time to get ready for it. But that message comes with the offer of help. So the people in the future are able to offer help to the people in the past by sending resources back through time travel. So what happens though then is in the game is that you then get those resources and then you have to pay them back later. And the longer that you wait to do that, the more what they call anomalies appear, which are basically rips in time and space that cause problems for you. Now, from a mechanical standpoint, these are basically loans. You take out loans, the longer you wait to pay them back, the more interest you pay. But it doesn't feel that way, in part because the game has a lot of different kinds of things you use. You have different kinds of workers, you have different kinds of resources, and when you pay back the loan, you have to pay back the same kind of resource that you got. So if you get an engineer to help you with building your society, you have to pay back an engineer. You have to send an engineer back through the time portal, which creates a kind of amusing space where you might get an engineer from the future, use him for a while, and then throw him back in the time portal to go back in time, which leads to the bootstrapping question of where did that engineer come from to begin with. But that's not really the point of the game. What I like about Anachrony is that it often, especially toward the end of the game, puts you in this situation of having not quite enough. You figure out, you get a lot of actions in Anachrony because you build up all these workers, and you want to do these 3 things. but you know you have to gather these 3 resources to do the 3 things, and you'll have 6 workers, but one of them you need to use to wake up the other workers, and just figuring out how to manage all of those pieces and stick them all together in a way that's going to work is just a delight. Another game that does this really well, one of my favorites, is Vladimir Suchi's Last Will, published by Czech Games Edition, CGE. Last Will is basically Brewster's Millions, the board game. So Brewster's Millions is a movie. The premise is you inherit some money, you have to spend it all in order to inherit the rest. So in Last Will, each player has got a pot of money. Your goal is to spend the most money by the end of the game. Or the first person to spend all their money triggers the end of the game. It's an interesting and really fun game, but again, you only have so many actions that you can do per round, and the whole point of the game is to get a system in place where you can get as much done with these narrow actions as you can. I mean, it's the same thing I like about Agricola, it's the same thing I like about Martin Wallace's Brass. I love the feeling of having limited resources and not quite enough actions to do everything you want, but still not feel like you can't get anything done. I mean, I really like when a game has multiple levers to pull, so if you can't do optimal thing A, you can still do choice B. Another good example is the Stefan Feld game Aquasphere. Aquasphere is this weird, you're working underwater and you've got these robots that you're directing, but it has a bunch of different ways you can score points. So if your opponent has started to outrun you in one area, or is taking the things you want to do in one area, you can then do those things in another area and get some benefit from it. But the parallel processing that you have to do in your brain to get all the pieces in place, that frisson of intellectual energy, is something I call the feeling of not quite enough. And I've identified 3 things that appear in games that create this feeling. And so this is something that I'm thinking about as a game designer working on games for Rattlebox Games. How can I try to cultivate that feeling in games I design? So here's the 3 things that I've identified. I would love to hear from you listeners. What kinds of things do you think create this tension or this feeling of not quite enough? So the first one is tight resources. Right? If you have a game where you have unlimited resources, or the resources are easily available, it makes it less likely that you're going to have this feeling because you can do whatever it is you want to do. I'm trying to think of a game that would have that, or a game where the resources are entirely randomized. You generally aren't going to have that feeling. Like Catan, right? You get your resources from rolling the die, and then you're bummed that you don't have enough wood to build another road, but it doesn't feel like if you had just worked things a little differently, you could have had enough wood. Unless you have a really robust trading group and it's about doing 4 different trades to get that 1 extra wood. But my guess is people aren't going to let you do that. So you got to have tight resources. The second thing is you have to have a limited number of turns or actions. And that's always true, but some games don't make it feel as though your turns are all that limited. For example, to be fair, I've only played each of these games once, but both Scythe and Euphoria have this thing where you have these workers that you're using, and you have a limited number of them, and you get them back in certain ways, or you can't do the same thing more than once in the case of Scythe. But because the game doesn't really operate in rounds, and because both games end when somebody succeeds rather than on a fixed clock, for me, neither of those games felt really tight, even though they were, because by the very nature of speeding to win. Right? In Scythe, you're trying to get those 7 stars, I think, before the other person gets their 7 stars. And if you don't get them quickly, you lose because the other person got them faster. So there is a speed competition element there that applies the pressure. But for me, that's very different than having a very limited number of turns. The epitome of this experience, the limited number of turns, and the things that make you feel that feeling of not quite enough, would be something like Agricola. Yuri Rosenberg's Agricola is a masterwork of not quite enough. You don't have enough people at the beginning. You only get 2 workers, and you only get 14 turns in the whole game. And if you're aggressive about it, you can get up to 5, I think, total workers by the end. But that takes a lot of your energy to produce that many workers. And you have to have opponents who are letting you do it too, right? Everybody's trying to get those workers. Dungeon Pets is another game where you have really limited number of workers. I mean, in Dungeon Pets, you start with 6 or maybe 8 workers, but you have to divide them up into groups to do actions. And generally, you're not going to get more than 2 or 3 actions at the beginning of the game, unless you just want crummy actions that nobody wants, right? If you do a bunch of single imp actions, you're probably not going to get to do anything fun, because everybody else is going to take all the monsters and the upgrades and the artifacts, and you're going to end up, I don't know, digging for gold, which isn't really a good way to win. So I love the games where you have a limited number of actions. And on top of that, games that have a limited number of turns apply another level of pressure. Although a lot of times those games, they're complex enough. Like Dungeon Pets, you get, I think there's 6 rounds, maybe 7. And by the time you get to that 7th round, even though you maybe want to go a couple more, you also probably want to be done. You've been playing 2.5 hours. But it's the intensity of having that limited number of actions that is the crucial thing. And then this third one is a little different. I mean, okay, how do I explain it? So I like games where the scoring is opaque enough that you don't know whether you're winning or not until you get to the end. So for instance, Agricola. Part of what makes Agricola so interesting to me is that there are 20 different levers that you score on. Not that many. There's like 8 or 9 different things you have to consider when you're doing your score, which to me means that maybe if I'd played it 100 times instead of 7 or 8, I would have this better. But it means that when I'm looking at someone else's board, I can kind of tell, yeah, they're probably doing better than I am, but I can't tell exactly how close we are. As opposed to, say, Ticket to Ride, where I can see exactly where we are in comparison to one another, although I can't tell how well they're going to do from their tickets. Or, gosh, I can't think of another game where you keep the score as you go along. Actually, Aquasphere, you keep the score as you go along. And as I recall, there's not a whole lot of endgame scoring. It's been a while since I've played that one. A good game that keeps that opaque scoring, there's Adam McIver's Ex Libris from Renegade Studios. That's a new one that just came out this last year. Ex Libris has this feeling of not enough actions. You only get 3 actions per round, and you're trying to collect books and shelve them. And the shelving is really interesting because a lot of times you want to maximize your efficiency, because a lot of the actions you take when you take a book, if you haven't seen Ex Libris, it's about collecting sort of mythological books on a bookshelf. It's more fun than it sounds. And actually, I think it sounds really fun. I'm a nerd. I like books. Organizing books at home is a fun thing to do anyway. So a game about that, it's right up my alley. But so in the game, a lot of the actions you do give you the choice to either take the card with the books into hand or shelve it right away. And the efficient choice is to shelve it right away, because then you're getting double duty out of the action. You get the card and you shelve it. The problem is, at the end of the game, any books that you have that are not in alphabetical order don't count. So if you shelve a book in the wrong order, you won't get to count it. Or if you shelve a book and then later you get another book that would have gone in ahead of it, you won't get to shelve that later book that you got, which may have been better. So there are cards that let you move around a little bit, but they're kind of rare. And the game has a lot of different things going on. So depending on which role you have or which spaces are out, you may be able to move around a little bit. But the long and short of it is, the game applies pressure. It says the smart, efficient thing to do is to shelve books when you get them. But the strategic part says hold your books and shelve them in the order that you want. And it creates this delicious tension where you don't have enough actions to do what you want to do. One of the things that makes Ex Libris probably more pleasurable, but makes it have less of that not enough actions feel, is that you get so long after the end of the game is triggered. So if you haven't played, the way Ex Libris works, you're getting these cards, you're putting them on your bookshelf. Each card represents a bunch of books that you've stuck on your shelf. As soon as someone, if you're playing 4 players, as soon as someone has added their 12th card to their bookshelf, then that triggers the end of the game. But what it triggers is that the next round will be the last round. So if someone adds a 12th book to their bookshelf at the beginning of, say, round 6, you're going to play through the end of round 7 before the game is over. Which means that that person who put in a 12th book could add several more books before the end of the game. It also means that you have time now, depending on when that person did it, how strategic they were, you have time to, get your affairs in order before the game is over. And while I think that's probably better, I'm sure McIver tested it both ways. I'm sure they tested it with a shorter lead-up time to the end, or a longer one, or a fixed time. They probably tested all of these options and found this to be the best one. Because it is really pleasurable to have that extra time. It still doesn't feel like enough time. I have yet to have a game of Ex Libris where somebody triggered the end of the game and I was like, oh, that's fine. I'm ready to be done. Every time it's like, oh man, I wish I just had one more turn, which is exactly the feeling I want. We have not enough turns. So that's one of my favorite things about games. I love a game where you have not quite enough time to do the things you want to do, or not quite enough resources, or not quite enough actions. Not quite enough. I'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to me at Rattlebox Games on Twitter, or Brendan at Rattlebox Games by email, or my username on BoardGameGeek is Wombat929. If you go to our website, rattleboxgames.com, there'll be a place there for you to go and talk about this. I'd love to hear what are games that you enjoy that have this not quite enough element. All right, thanks. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Here's hoping your walk goes well.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.